The roar of 1,000 aircraft engines, a sound Lieutenant General Wilhelm Falley had never before experienced, consumed the Norman night on June 6, 1944, at 0115 hours. His staff car lurched forward, its engine straining as his driver pressed for speed, racing towards Falley's headquarters at Chateau de Bernaville. Just hours earlier, 125 miles away in Rennes, Falley had been immersed in a war game, a simulation of an Allied invasion, precisely the scenario now unfolding around him. Yet, this real invasion found him desperately trying to reach his command, unaware that the enemy was already behind his lines. He would not make it. This night of chaotic drops and desperate gambles would set the stage for one of the most pivotal operations of the Second World War, a story that begins with a German general unknowingly driving towards an ambush at his own headquarters, and concludes with a revelation of how strategic defiance reshaped the very nature of conflict. Unbeknownst to Falley, 13,000 American paratroopers were already dispersed across the Cotentin Peninsula, their descent into darkness marked by terrifying uncertainty. Some found themselves in waterlogged marshes, others crashed through the roofs of French farmhouses, and some landed directly onto German positions, perishing before their boots touched French soil. But many more began to coalesce in the pre-dawn gloom, methodically severing communication lines, disrupting enemy convoys, and seizing crucial bridges that would prove decisive for the success or failure of history's largest invasion. The decision to initiate this unprecedented airborne assault, the last of its kind, was fraught with difficulty. For months, Allied strategists had grappled with the feasibility of the paratroopers' mission, fearing they would be annihilated before dawn. Air Chief Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory, who commanded the Allied Expeditionary Air Force, had consistently voiced his opposition to the American airborne drops. He believed the Germans had deployed too many anti-aircraft batteries along the planned flight paths, predicting a staggering casualty rate of 70% or higher for both the transport aircraft and their human cargo. In his estimation, the paratroopers would be scattered, isolated, and ultimately destroyed before they could mount any significant resistance. Leigh-Mallory presented his grave concerns directly to General Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander. On May 29, 1944, a mere 8 days before D-Day, he formally recommended the complete cancellation of the American airborne operation, labeling it a futile slaughter. Eisenhower listened intently. He understood the profound risks better than anyone, recognizing the potential for catastrophic losses. However, he also grasped that without the paratroopers, the Utah beach landings would face unacceptable peril. The causeways leading inland were natural bottlenecks, perfect for German defenders to concentrate their fire and decimate the landing troops before they could break out. The paratroopers represented the sole force capable of securing these vital passages before the Germans could react. Ultimately, Eisenhower overruled Leigh-Mallory. The airborne assault would proceed as planned, a decision that weighed heavily on him. On the evening of June 5, Eisenhower visited the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne at Greenham Common Airfield. He moved among the young soldiers as they prepared for their jump, shaking hands, inquiring about their hometowns, and offering words of encouragement. Photographs from that night reveal Eisenhower surrounded by men with blackened faces and mohawk haircuts, soldiers who understood that they might not survive the coming hours. After his visit, Eisenhower returned to his headquarters and penned a brief statement, intended for release only if the invasion failed. It read, in part, "If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." He then tucked the note into his pocket and awaited news from Normandy. The primary challenge confronting Allied planners in early 1944 wasn't merely landing troops on the Normandy beaches, it was ensuring those troops could survive long enough to establish a secure foothold. Germany's Atlantic Wall defenses were formidable, concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, and artillery batteries zeroed in on every potential approach. The beaches themselves were meticulously engineered killing zones, designed to ensnare landing craft in devastating crossfire and slaughter infantry before they could reach cover. Yet, the beaches were just the initial hurdle. Beyond lay the Norman countryside, a labyrinth of hedgerows, sunken roads, and flooded lowlands. German reserves positioned inland could launch counterattacks within hours of any landing. If these reserves reached the beaches before the Allies consolidated their positions, the entire invasion could be repelled back into the English Channel. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel understood this perfectly. For months, he had meticulously reinforced the Atlantic Wall, planting millions of mines, installing beach obstacles, and strategically positioning his forces for an immediate counterattack. Rommel firmly believed the invasion's fate would be sealed within the first 24 hours. If the Germans could contain the Allies on the beaches and rapidly deploy their armor, they could drive the invaders back into the sea. Failure to react swiftly enough, however, would allow the Allies to establish an unshakable bridgehead. Rommel had personally overseen the construction of obstacles specifically designed to thwart airborne landings. Fields suitable for glider operations were impaled with wooden stakes, some topped with mines or artillery shells rigged to detonate on impact. The Germans dubbed these lethal impediments Rommel's Spargel, Rommel's asparagus. Entire meadows were transformed into deadly forests of sharpened poles, intended to impale gliders and kill their occupants before they could even disembark. Rommel's ingenuity also extended to the flooding of the lowlands. By opening sluice gates and blocking drainage channels, the Germans had converted vast stretches of the Cotentin Peninsula into impassable marshes. The water, often only waist deep, concealed soft mud that could trap and drown a man weighed down by parachute equipment. These flooded areas also rendered aerial photographs useless for identifying safe landing zones. Fields that appeared solid from above were, in reality, submerged. Despite these extensive preparations, Rommel harbored little confidence. He knew the Atlantic Wall was far from complete. Construction materials were scarce, and labor had been diverted to other projects. Many concrete bunkers existed only on paper. The troops manning the defenses were often second-rate, comprising older soldiers, men with health issues, and conscripts from occupied nations with scant loyalty to Germany. Elite units, the Panzer Divisions and SS formations, were held in reserve far from the coast, unable to intervene swiftly if the Allies achieved surprise. Rommel had repeatedly argued that the armor should be moved closer to the beaches, wanting the Panzer Divisions positioned to counterattack within hours of any landing. But his superior, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, disagreed. Rundstedt believed the armor should be held back and committed only once the main Allied thrust was identified. The two field marshals had clashed over this issue for months, and the compromise solution satisfied neither. The armor was positioned too far back to respond quickly, yet too far forward to be concentrated for a decisive counterattack. The Allied solution to this dilemma was audacious. Before a single soldier touched the beaches, thousands of paratroopers would drop behind the Atlantic Wall. These airborne forces would seize vital bridges, block roads, demolish communications, and prevent German reserves from reaching the landing zones. The paratroopers would be outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded deep within enemy territory. Yet, if they could hold their objectives for just a few hours, they would provide the beach landing forces the crucial time needed to break through. The American airborne assault would be the largest in history. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, comprising over 13,000 paratroopers, were slated to drop onto the Cotentin Peninsula in the early hours of June 6. Their objectives, spread across 39 square kilometers of Norman farmland, included capturing the town of St. Mireglès, securing 4 causeways leading inland from Utah Beach, seizing bridges over the Murderette and Dove rivers, and neutralizing German positions that could threaten the landing forces. The causeways were perhaps the most critical objective. The Germans had deliberately flooded much of the lowland behind Utah Beach, transforming the landscape into an impassable swamp. Only 4 narrow causeways traversed this flooded terrain, connecting the beach to the dry ground inland. If the Germans held these causeways, they could trap the landing forces on the beach and destroy them at leisure. If the Americans secured the causeways before the beach landings, the 4th Infantry Division could push inland quickly and link up with the airborne forces. The 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, was tasked with capturing and holding these causeways until relieved. Their commanding officer was Major General Maxwell Taylor, a tall, scholarly-looking man who had served as the 82nd Airborne's artillery commander during the Sicily campaign. Taylor, 42 years old, experienced yet still vigorous, had insisted on jumping with his men despite his rank. He believed a general who asked his soldiers to jump into combat should be willing to jump with them. Taylor's division would drop on 3 designated drop zones, A, C, and D, east of the flooded areas. From there, they would move west to secure the causeways before the Germans could react. It was a complex mission demanding precise timing and coordination, precisely the elements airborne operations rarely achieved. Every paratrooper understood the risks. They would be jumping into darkness, into enemy territory, with no armor support and limited ammunition. Many would land miles from their objectives. Some would land directly on German units, others would drown in flooded fields, or become entangled in trees. The expected casualty rate was over 50%, but they were the only force capable of accomplishing the task. Training for Operation Overlord had been relentless. Since arriving in England in late 1943, the paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions had practiced night jumps, close-quarters combat, and small-unit tactics until every man could execute his role blindfolded. They studied sand tables depicting their drop zones, memorized recognition signals, and learned to identify landmarks they would never see in daylight. Brigadier General James Gavin, the Assistant Division Commander of the 82nd Airborne, was 37 years old and one of the most experienced airborne officers in the American military. He had commanded the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment during the invasion of Sicily and the landings at Salerno. He knew what could go wrong during a night combat jump: aircraft could be scattered by anti-aircraft fire, paratroopers could land miles from their objectives, and units could be separated and destroyed piecemeal before they could organize. Gavin had meticulously designed the Norman operation to account for these risks. Instead of concentrating his forces on a few drop zones, he dispersed them across a wider area. If the drops were scattered, as they almost certainly would be, small groups of paratroopers could still achieve local objectives. The key was initiative. Every man had to understand the overall mission well enough to contribute, even if he never found his unit. The Pathfinders would go in first. These specially trained teams would jump 30 minutes ahead of the main force, locate the drop zones, and set up electronic beacons called Eureka transponders. Aircraft in the main formation were equipped with Rebecca receivers that could home in on the Eureka signals and guide the pilots to the correct drop zones. The Pathfinders would also deploy krypton lights, visible only from above, to mark the boundaries of each landing area. On the evening of June 5, 1944, the Pathfinders gathered at airfields across southern England. Captain Frank Lyman of the 101st Airborne led the team tasked with marking drop zone and near Saint-Germain-de-Variville. He was 29 years old, a veteran of the Sicily jump, and one of the first Americans to volunteer for airborne duty. At 2,215 hours, Lyman and his team boarded their C-47 transport aircraft. They would be the first American soldiers to set foot in Nazi-occupied France on D-Day. The Pathfinders carried over 50 pounds of specialized equipment in addition to their standard combat load. Each team had multiple Eureka transponders as backups, as a single equipment failure could doom an entire drop zone. They carried krypton lights, which emitted infrared beams visible only through special goggles worn by the pilots. They also carried smoke grenades, signal panels, and handheld lights for emergency marking, along with enough ammunition to defend their positions until the main force arrived. The flight across the English Channel was smooth. The pilots flew at a low altitude, just 150 meters above the water, to avoid German radar. As the aircraft crossed the French coast, the Pathfinders could discern the dark outlines of the Cotentin Peninsula beneath them. Then, the clouds closed in. The weather over Normandy was worse than anticipated. A thick cloud bank obscured the ground, forcing the pilots to climb to avoid it. When they descended again, they were off course. German anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, and the pilots took evasive action, scattering the formations further. Of the 18 aircraft carrying Pathfinders to the American drop zones, only one managed to deliver its team to the correct location. Lyman and his Pathfinders landed nearly 2 kilometers north of their assigned drop zone. They had mere minutes to set up their beacons before the main force arrived. Working in darkness, under the constant threat of German patrols, they assembled their Eureka transponder and activated it. The signal pulsed into the night sky, a radio beacon that would guide hundreds of aircraft to this patch of Norman farmland. But for most of the other Pathfinder teams, things went wrong. Some landed in flooded marshes and lost their equipment. Others landed directly on German positions and were immediately engaged in firefights. One team was dropped over the English Channel and never reached France. Of the 6 drop zones designated for American paratroopers, only Drop Zone O, assigned to the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, had its beacons fully operational when the main force arrived. At 2,330 hours on June 5, the main airborne assault began. Over 1,000 C-47 aircraft took off from airfields across England, carrying more than 13,000 paratroopers into the night. The aircraft flew in tight formations, their navigation lights extinguished, their engines roaring as they climbed to cruising altitude. Inside each plane, 18 to 20 paratroopers sat in 2 rows facing each other. Their parachutes and equipment added over 40 kilograms to each man's weight. The paratroopers were equipped for combat in ways no soldiers had been before. Each man carried a main parachute on his back and a reserve chute on his chest. Over that, he wore a harness loaded with equipment, ammunition pouches, grenades, a knife strapped to his boot, a first aid kit, emergency rations, and a gas mask that most men would discard as soon as they landed. Some carried additional gear, like demolitions for blowing bridges or radios for calling in support, with total weight often exceeding 100 pounds. The uniform itself was distinctive. The M42 jump jacket had large cargo pockets on the chest and thighs, the jump trousers had reinforced knees for landing impacts, and the boots were specially designed with thick soles and ankle support to absorb the shock of hitting the ground at 15 miles per hour. Every man wore a steel helmet with a chin cup strapped tight to prevent the helmet from flying off during the drop. Weapons varied by assignment. Riflemen carried the M1 Garand, an 8-round semi-automatic that was the finest infantry rifle of its era. Squad leaders often carried the Thompson submachine gun, devastating in close quarters. Some men had Browning automatic rifles, heavy but capable of suppressive fire. And every man carried a .45 caliber pistol as a backup, because in the chaos of a night drop, you never knew what weapon you might need. The mood was tense. Many of the paratroopers had painted their faces with war paint or shaved their heads into mohawk cuts, a tradition borrowed from Native American warriors. They joked nervously, checked their equipment for the 100th time, and tried not to think about what awaited them on the ground. Some men wrote letters home they would never mail, others prayed silently in the darkness. As the aircraft crossed the French coast, the cloud bank that had troubled the Pathfinders engulfed the main formations. Pilots who had trained for months to fly precise patterns found themselves blind in a wall of gray vapor. Some climbed above the clouds, others descended below them. The tight formations that had left England dissolved into chaos. Then, the anti-aircraft fire erupted. German flak batteries along the coast opened up on the aircraft with tracer rounds and exploding shells. The sky lit up with orange and red bursts. Pilots threw their aircraft into evasive maneuvers, banking hard, climbing, diving, anything to escape the murderous fire. Formations scattered further. Aircraft that had been flying wingtip to wingtip now found themselves alone in the darkness, their pilots unsure of their position, their navigators struggling to identify landmarks below. Inside the aircraft, the paratroopers felt the planes shudder and lurch. Some men were thrown from their seats, others gripped the static lines that would open their parachutes and waited for the green light that would signal them to jump. The pilots, desperate to escape the flak, began turning on their green lights early. Some paratroopers jumped while still over the English Channel, others jumped miles from their intended drop zones. The carefully planned assault was degenerating into chaos before the first American boot touched French soil. Brigadier General Gavin jumped with the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment at approximately 0151 hours. His aircraft had been scattered by the clouds and flak, and he landed several kilometers from his intended drop zone. When he hit the ground, he found himself alone in a flooded field, waist-deep in cold water, with no idea where he was. Gavin waded out of the marsh and began searching for other paratroopers. He found a small group from mixed units, men who had landed as scattered as he had. Together, they oriented themselves by the stars and began moving toward their objectives. Gavin would eventually gather over 300 men from various regiments and lead them toward the crucial bridge at La Fere, one of only 2 crossing points over the flooded Murderet River. The scattered drops created nightmarish conditions for the paratroopers. Men who had trained together for months now found themselves surrounded by strangers. Some landed in the middle of German encampments and were killed before they could cut themselves free from their parachutes. Others drowned in the flooded lowlands, dragged under by the weight of their equipment. The Germans had deliberately flooded large areas of the Cotentin Peninsula to prevent exactly this kind of airborne assault, and the water claimed dozens of American lives. But the scattered drops also created chaos for the Germans. The paratroopers of the 101st Airborne had been issued small brass clickers, devices that made a distinctive click-clack sound when squeezed. In the darkness of the Norman countryside, where every shadow could be an enemy, the clickers provided a simple recognition signal. 1 click demanded a response of 2 clicks. If the response was correct, the approaching figure was friendly; if not, the paratrooper opened fire. The 82nd Airborne had declined to use the crickets, relying instead on the verbal challenge, flash, with the proper response being, thunder. Throughout the night, the clicking sounds echoed across the Cotentin Peninsula as isolated soldiers found each other in the darkness. Small groups formed, dissolved, and reformed as men moved toward their objectives or simply tried to survive until dawn. Some groups grew to platoon strength, others remained just 2 or 3 men fighting their own private war against the German occupation. Sergeant Elmo Jones of the 82nd Airborne landed alone in a field near Saint-Mier-Église. He was one of the pathfinders, dropped ahead of the main force to mark the drop zones. When his boots hit French soil, he looked around at the dark, empty countryside and said to himself, "Damn! I just cracked the Atlantic Wall." Jones was not wrong. He was among the first American soldiers to set foot in Nazi-occupied France on D-Day. Within hours, thousands more would follow, and the Atlantic Wall that Hitler had spent years building would begin to crumble. Lieutenant General Wilhelm Falley had departed his headquarters at Chateau de Bernaville on the afternoon of June 5 to attend the war game in Rennes. The exercise had been organized by General Friedrich Dahlmann, commander of the German 7th Army, to test German responses to an Allied invasion. The scenario they practiced was almost exactly what was now happening, an Allied airborne assault followed by amphibious landings. The irony was bitter. Falley commanded the 91st Luftland Infantry Division, a unit specifically trained to counter airborne operations. His division was positioned in the center of the Cotentin Peninsula, directly in the path of the American drops. When reports began coming in of parachutes in the night sky, Falley knew immediately this was no drill. He ordered his driver to turn around and race back to his headquarters, but the roads of Normandy were no longer safe. American paratroopers were scattered across the countryside, and small groups of them had set up ambushes at key intersections. Falley's staff car sped through the darkness, passing burning buildings and distant gunfire. Above, the roar of aircraft engines continued without pause. At approximately 0400 hours, Falley's car approached the rear entrance of his headquarters at Chateau de Bernaville. He did not know that American paratroopers had already reached the area. A group of about a dozen men from the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, led by First Lieutenant Malcolm Brannan, had established an ambush near the chateau. They were lost, far from their intended drop zone, and had been searching for their objectives when they heard the approaching vehicle. Brannan called out for the car to stop. The driver did not comply. The paratroopers opened fire. The staff car, riddled with bullets, crashed into a wall. Lieutenant General Wilhelm Falley was killed instantly. His aide, Major Joachim Bertuzet, died with him. Falley became the first German general to die in the Normandy invasion, killed not on a battlefield, but on the road to his own headquarters by soldiers who did not even know who he was. The death of Falley plunged the 91st Division into confusion at the worst possible moment. With their commander dead and their communications severed by other groups of paratroopers, the German units in the area could not coordinate an effective response. They knew the Americans were somewhere in the darkness, but they did not know where, how many, or what their objectives were. This confusion was precisely what the scattered drops had created. German commanders across the Cotentin Peninsula were receiving reports of parachute landings from dozens of different locations. Some reports placed the Americans north of St. Mireglès, others south of Cotentin. Still others reported landings near the beaches themselves. The German picture of the American assault was fragmented and contradictory. Making matters worse, the Allies had deliberately amplified the confusion. Operation Titanic, a deception operation conducted by the Special Air Service and the Royal Air Force, had dropped approximately 500 dummy paratroopers at locations far from the actual drop zones. These dummies, nicknamed Ruperts, were 3-foot-tall figures made of Hessian cloth and stuffed with straw or sand. Each dummy was equipped with small explosive charges that simulated rifle fire upon landing, and some were accompanied by real SAS soldiers who played recordings of battle sounds and shouted commands. The British had named the dummies Ruperts after the slang term British soldiers used for inexperienced officers. The irony was intentional. These seemingly useless cloth figures would prove more valuable than many human counterparts in sowing confusion among the German defenders. Operation Titanic was divided into 4 separate missions. Titanic 1 dropped 200 dummies and 2 SAS teams near the base of the Cotentin Peninsula, simulating a division-sized airborne assault. Titanic 2 was planned for east of the Dives River but was cancelled at the last moment due to air traffic congestion. Titanic 3 dropped 50 dummies southwest of Cannes. Titanic 4 dropped 200 more dummies near Marigny, accompanied by additional SAS teams. The SAS soldiers who accompanied the dummies had one of the most dangerous assignments of the entire invasion. They jumped into enemy territory with orders to create as much noise and confusion as possible, then escape back to Allied lines. They set up gramophones, playing recordings of gunfire and shouting soldiers. They fired their weapons at random intervals to simulate a larger force. And crucially, they were ordered to allow some German soldiers to escape, so that reports of the fake landings would reach German headquarters. The 6-man team of Titanic 4, led by Captain Frederick Fowles and Lieutenant Norman Poole, landed at 10 minutes past midnight on June 6. They were the very first soldiers of any nation to land in France on D-Day, arriving 10 minutes before Major John Howard's glider force seized Pegasus Bridge. For the next 40 days, the SAS men would hide behind German lines, aided by the French resistance, before finally reaching Allied positions. Of the SAS soldiers involved in Operation Titanic, 8 failed to return. They were either killed in action or executed after capture. 2 of the short Sterling aircraft carrying the dummies were shot down, killing their crews. The human cost of the deception was real. But the deception worked. The Ruperts completely fooled the Germans. Reports of parachute landings poured in from areas where no Americans had landed at all. The German 915th Grenadier Regiment, part of the reserve force that should have reinforced the beaches, was diverted to investigate a phantom landing south of their position. The 12th SS Panzer Division, one of the most formidable armored units in the area, sent elements to chase the dummy paratroopers instead of moving towards the real threat. By dawn on June 6, the German High Command still did not have a clear picture of what was happening. They knew the Americans had landed somewhere in the Cotentin Peninsula. They knew there had been casualties and confusion, but they did not know the scope of the assault, the location of the main objectives, or how to concentrate their forces for a counterattack. And they did not know that the most critical German commander was not at his headquarters to lead them. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the man responsible for the Atlantic Wall, was in Germany celebrating his wife Lucy's 50th birthday. Rommel had left his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon on June 5, comforting his family that the weather was too poor for an Allied invasion. German meteorologists had predicted continued storms over the English Channel, and Rommel believed he had time for a brief visit home. He had even purchased a pair of grey suede shoes in Paris as a birthday gift for his wife. When the invasion began, Rommel was in Stuttgart, hundreds of kilometers from the front. He did not learn of the airborne landings until after 1,000 hours on June 6, when his chief of staff, Major General Hans Speidel, reached him by telephone. By then, the American paratroopers had been on the ground for nearly 9 hours, and the beach landings had already begun. Rommel rushed back to Normandy, but he arrived too late to influence the critical first hours of the battle. The man who had insisted that the invasion must be defeated on the beaches was not there when the moment came. The German response was delayed, confused, and uncoordinated, exactly as the Allied planners had hoped. While the Germans struggled to understand what was happening, the American paratroopers were fighting for their lives. In Saint-Mireglisse, a small town on the main road from Cherbourg to Caen, the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment dropped directly into a firestorm. A house in the town center had caught fire earlier that evening, and the flames illuminated the sky as the paratroopers descended. German soldiers stationed in the town saw the Americans floating down and opened fire. The fire had started in the home of Madame Pommier around 2,300 hours on June 5. The townspeople, under German supervision, had formed a bucket brigade to fight the flames. They were still working when the first paratroopers appeared in the sky. For the Germans, it was like shooting targets at a carnival. The Americans were silhouetted against the flames, their parachutes glowing orange in the firelight. There was no cover, no concealment, nowhere to hide. Some paratroopers landed in the town square and were killed before they could cut themselves free from their harnesses. Others landed on rooftops, in trees, in gardens. One man landed directly in the fire and burned to death. The Germans shot them as they came down, as they hit the ground, as they struggled with their equipment. It was a massacre. Private John Steele of F Company landed on the church steeple in the center of the town square. His parachute caught on the spire, and he hung there, wounded and helpless, while the battle raged below him. A piece of shrapnel from a German anti-aircraft shell had torn through his foot during the descent. He could do nothing but hang there and watch his comrades die. Steele played dead for over 2 hours. He hung motionless against the stone facade of the church, listening to the gunfire below, watching the flames from the burning building cast shadows across the square. German soldiers looked up at him but assumed he was dead. Eventually, around 0400 hours, a German soldier named Rudolf May climbed the church tower and cut Steele down. He was taken prisoner, but he would later escape and rejoin American forces. Steele's image hanging from the church would become one of the most famous of the entire invasion. In 1962, the movie The Longest Day recreated the scene, with actor Red Buttons playing Steele. Today, a mannequin dressed in paratrooper gear hangs from the church steeple, a permanent memorial to the man who survived the longest night of his life suspended above a battlefield. Despite the chaos, Lieutenant Colonel Edward Krauss of the 3rd Battalion managed to gather enough men to assault the town. By 0430 hours, barely 3 hours after the first drops, the American flag was flying over Saint-Mireglisse. It was the first town in France to be liberated on D-Day, but holding the town would prove harder than taking it. German forces counterattacked throughout the day, and the paratroopers fought desperate defensive battles in the streets and hedgerows. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Vandervoort, whose ankle had been broken during the jump, refused evacuation and commanded his battalion from a commandeered cart, directing the defense of the northern approaches to the town. One of the most critical defensive actions was fought by Lieutenant Turner Turnbull and a small group of paratroopers at Neuville-aux-Plaines, a crossroads about 2 kilometers north of Saint-Mireglisse. Vandervoort sent Turnbull and approximately 42 men to establish a roadblock and prevent German reinforcements from reaching the town. Turnbull set up his position at first light and waited. He did not have to wait long. German forces from the 958th Grenadier Regiment, supported by artillery and armor, launched repeated attacks against his position throughout the morning. The Americans had no anti-tank weapons capable of stopping the German armor. They had limited ammunition. They had no reinforcements. For over 4 hours, Turnbull and his men held the line. They repulsed attack after attack, using every weapon they had, fighting from ditches and hedgerows, falling back when necessary and counterattacking when possible. By early afternoon, most of Turnbull's men were dead or wounded. That evening, Turnbull led his surviving 16 men back to Saint-Mireglisse. He was killed the following morning, June 7, leading a counterattack against a German advance. The sacrifice at Neuville-aux-Plaines bought precious time for the defenders of Saint-Mireglisse. Without Turnbull's roadblock, German reinforcements would have reached the town hours earlier, before the American defenses were properly organized. The 42 men who held that crossroads changed the course of the battle. Further west, the battle for the bridges over the Murderette River was even more desperate. The Germans had flooded the lowlands around the river, turning the narrow causeways into the only passable routes. Whoever controlled the bridges at La Fère and Chef Dupont controlled access to the entire area. Brigadier General Gavin led his mixed force of over 300 paratroopers toward La Fère. They arrived to find that elements of the 507th Regiment had already seized the bridge, but German counterattacks were pushing them back. 2 captured French tanks, Renault R-35s now in German service, rumbled down the causeway toward the American positions. The paratroopers had limited anti-tank weapons. Bazooka teams moved into position and waited for the tanks to close the range. When the lead tank reached the bridge, they fired. The first tank exploded. The second tank continued forward, and the paratroopers destroyed it as well. But a third tank appeared, and this time the Americans had no more rockets. Major Frederick Kellum, commander of the 1st Battalion, and his deputy Captain Dale Royston saw the threat. They grabbed anti-tank ammunition from 4 fallen soldiers, crossed the bridge under fire, and ran toward the line of contact to resupply the defenders. Both men were killed before they could reach the front. The third tank was eventually destroyed by other paratroopers, but the cost had been high. The battle for La Fère would continue for 4 more days. German forces counterattacked repeatedly, and the causeway became a killing ground for both sides. On June 9, the Americans launched a desperate assault to break the German grip on the western end of the causeway. The 325th Glider Infantry Regiment, which had arrived by glider the previous day, was given the mission. The plan was simple but brutal. The glider men would charge across the 500-meter causeway in a frontal assault, directly into German machine gun fire. The assault began at 1,000 hours, preceded by a 15-minute artillery barrage. Then the men of the 3rd Battalion stepped onto the causeway and began walking toward the German positions. They could not run because the road was too narrow and too cluttered with debris. They could only walk into the teeth of the German fire, watching their comrades fall around them. The Germans had positioned machine guns to sweep the causeway from multiple angles. Mortar rounds exploded among the advancing Americans. Men fell and were trampled by those behind them. The causeway became jammed with the dead and dying. At one point, a Sherman tank supporting the assault was hit by a mine and blocked the road, forcing the infantry to squeeze past the burning vehicle while under fire. General Matthew Ridgway, commander of the 82nd Airborne Division, was seen on the causeway during the height of the fighting, personally removing a cable from the disabled tank to clear the road. His assistant division commander, General Gavin, joined him. The sight of the division's 2 highest-ranking officers in the middle of the killing zone inspired the men to push forward despite their losses. By noon, the Americans had broken through. The German defenders fled, and the causeway was finally secure, but the cost had been staggering. The 325th Glider Infantry Regiment suffered over 200 casualties in the single morning assault. The fields around La Fère were covered with American dead. When the fighting finally ended on June 9, the Americans held the bridge, but the surrounding fields were carpeted with dead. Military historian S.L.A. Marshall would later describe the battle for La Fère as, probably the bloodiest small unit struggle in the experience of American arms. By the end of June 6, the American Airborne Divisions had accomplished most of their critical objectives, despite the scattered drops and heavy casualties. Saint-Mère-Église was in American hands. 3 of the 4 causeways leading from Utah Beach had been secured. The bridges over the Murderette and Douve rivers were either captured or destroyed. German communications throughout the Cotentin Peninsula had been disrupted. The cost had been enormous. Over 2,400 American paratroopers were killed, wounded, or missing on D-Day alone. Many units had suffered over 50% casualties. Some companies had been virtually wiped out. The 101st Airborne Division would report that only 1 in 6 of its soldiers reached their planned rally points. But the paratroopers had done what they were sent to do. They had prevented the German reserves from reaching the beaches during the critical first hours. They had created confusion and chaos behind the Atlantic Wall. They had tied down thousands of German troops who should have been counterattacking the landing forces. At Utah Beach, where the 4th Infantry Division came ashore at 0630 hours, the German defenses were in disarray. The causeways that should have been choke points for the advancing Americans were already in friendly hands. The German units that should have been rushing to reinforce the coast were scattered across the peninsula, chasing paratroopers, investigating phantom landings, and trying to coordinate a response without their commanders. The troops landing on Utah Beach suffered fewer than 200 casualties, the lightest of any of the 5 invasion beaches. They pushed inland quickly, linked up with the airborne forces, and began the advance towards Cherbourg. The contrast with Omaha Beach, where over 2,000 Americans died in the bloodiest fighting of the day, was stark. The difference was the paratroopers. The German commanders who survived D-Day struggled to explain what had happened. Official reports blamed the weather, the scattered response, and the death of key officers. But the fundamental problem was simpler: the Germans had been surprised, not just by the timing of the invasion, but by the audacity of the airborne assault. They had expected the Allies to land on the beaches and push inland in a conventional advance. They had not expected 13,000 paratroopers to drop behind their lines in the middle of the night, seize their bridges, cut their communications, and kill their generals before the sun rose. The Atlantic Wall had been designed to stop an invasion from the sea. It had no answer for an invasion that came from the sky. Major Friedrich von der Heydt commanded the German 6th Parachute Regiment, one of the most elite units in the Cotentin Peninsula. He tried to organize a coordinated response, but the confusion was too great. His regiment fought scattered engagements across the peninsula throughout June 6, never able to concentrate its strength against a single American objective. Von der Heydt would later write that the American airborne assault succeeded not because of its precision, but because of its audacity. The scattered drops, which seemed like a failure at the time, actually made the American force appear larger and more widespread than it was. German commanders could not determine where the main effort was, because there was no single main effort. Every small group of paratroopers was fighting its own battle, creating a chaos that no defensive plan could address. The Allies had turned their greatest weakness into their greatest strength. Field Marshal Rommel arrived back at his headquarters late on June 7. By then, the beaches were secure, the paratroopers had linked up with the landing forces, and the opportunity to throw the invasion back into the sea had passed. Rommel spent the following weeks trying to contain the Allied bridgehead, but the momentum had shifted. The Germans were now on the defensive, and they would remain on the defensive until the end of the war. Rommel himself would not survive the campaign. On July 17, his staff car was strafed by Allied fighter aircraft near St. Foy de Montgomery. He was severely wounded and evacuated to Germany. 3 months later, implicated in the July 20 plot to assassinate Hitler, he was given a choice between suicide and a show trial. He chose suicide. He was buried with full military honors, and the German public was told he had died of his wounds. The paratroopers who survived D-Day continued fighting across France and into Germany. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions would make more combat jumps during Operation Market Garden in the Netherlands and Operation Varsity in Germany. Many of the men who jumped into Normandy would not live to see the end of the war. The 82nd Airborne remained in Normandy for 33 days, fighting without relief until early July. By the time they were withdrawn, they had suffered over 5,000 casualties, more than half their original strength. The 101st suffered similar losses. Some companies that had jumped with over 150 men on June 6 had fewer than 20 left by the time they returned to England. But their sacrifice had made the liberation of Europe possible. Maxwell Taylor, commander of the 101st Airborne, jumped with his men on D-Day and survived the campaign. He would later become Army Chief of Staff and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under Presidents Kennedy and Johnson. He remained an advocate for airborne forces throughout his career, always insisting that properly trained paratroopers could accomplish missions that conventional infantry could not attempt. Matthew Ridgway, commander of the 82nd Airborne, also survived the war. He went on to command the 18 Airborne Corps, then the 8th Army in Korea, where he reversed the course of the war after Chinese intervention. He later served as Supreme Allied Commander in Europe and Army Chief of Staff. He was known throughout his career for leading from the front, a habit he had developed during the desperate fighting in Normandy. Lieutenant Malcolm Brannan, the young officer who had killed General Falley in the darkness outside Chateau de Bernaville, survived the war. He returned to the United States and lived until 1999, dying at the age of 88. He rarely spoke about the night he killed a German general. When asked, he simply said he had done what any soldier would do. The chateau where Falley died still stands. The wall where his staff car crashed has been repaired. A small memorial marks the spot where the first German general of the invasion fell to a group of lost paratroopers who did not even know who he was. Sainte-Mère-Église has never forgotten its liberators. The church where John Steele hung from the steeple now has a stained-glass window depicting the Virgin Mary surrounded by American paratroopers. A dummy paratrooper hangs from the church to this day, a reminder of the night when the sky filled with silk and the liberation of France began. The Airborne Museum in Sainte-Mère-Église houses artifacts from the invasion, including original equipment, photographs, and personal effects of the men who jumped into the darkness on June 6, 1944. Visitors come from all over the world to walk the streets where the first battle was fought, and to pay their respects to the men who gave everything. Every year on June 6, the town holds a ceremony to honor the paratroopers. Veterans, many now in their late 90s, return to stand on the same ground where they landed as young men. The crowd falls silent as the names of the fallen are read. The American flag still flies over the town hall, just as it did on that first morning of liberation. General James Gavin went on to become one of the most respected military leaders of his generation. He commanded the 82nd Airborne Division through the rest of the war, making combat jumps in the Netherlands and Germany. After the war, he served as the United States ambassador to France and became a prominent critic of the Vietnam War. He died in 1990 at the age of 82 and was buried at West Point Cemetery, the military academy he had attended and that he called his Spartan mother. A memorial plaque at La Fère marks the foxhole where he commanded during the desperate fighting for the causeway. The bridge at La Fère still crosses the Murderette River. A statue called Iron Mike, depicting a paratrooper in combat gear, stands nearby as a memorial to the men who fought there. The causeway where so many died is quiet now, lined with hedgerows and fields that show no trace of the violence that occurred there 8 decades ago. The lessons of the D-Day airborne assault shaped military doctrine for generations: the importance of surprise, the value of decentralized operations, the necessity of initiative at every level. These principles were written in blood on the fields of Normandy. Every airborne operation since has built on the foundation laid by the men who jumped into the darkness on June 6, 1944. The 82nd Airborne Division remains one of the most elite units in the United States Army. Their headquarters at Fort Liberty, formerly Fort Bragg, includes a drop zone named Sainte-Mère-Église, in honor of the French town their predecessors liberated. New generations of paratroopers train on that ground, learning the skills that their grandfathers and great-grandfathers used to breach the Atlantic Wall. The 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, also continues to serve. Their legacy includes not only Normandy but also the defense of Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge, operations in Vietnam, and deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. The division's motto, Rendezvous with Destiny, was coined before D-Day, but it was in Normandy that the words took on their full meaning. What happened on June 6, 1944, was more than a military operation. It was a demonstration of what ordinary men can accomplish when they are willing to jump into the unknown. 13,000 young Americans, most of them in their late teens or early 20s, stepped out of aircraft doors into the darkness over enemy territory. They had no guarantee of survival, no certainty of success, only the knowledge that their mission mattered. Many of them never came home. Their bodies lie in the American cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer, overlooking Omaha Beach, or in smaller cemeteries scattered across Normandy. Their graves are marked with white crosses and stars of David, row upon row of young men who gave their lives so that others might be free. The German general who raced through the night to command his division never arrived. The paratroopers who ambushed him did not know his name or his rank. They were lost, far from their objectives, doing the only thing they could do, fight wherever they found the enemy. That is how the invasion was won, not through perfect planning or flawless execution, but through the determination of young men who refused to give up, even when everything went wrong. The men who fought against America left the most honest record of its power. Battlescars brings you one of those stories every single day. If this one held you to the end, subscribe, tomorrow's story is already waiting. And your next one is right here.